The program says these are financially sustainable, member-controlled, and member-organized, but that goes beyond that. Okay, so to get into this and to really understand this, we have to understand how CLFs work and how CLFs have their impact. Okay, so we start off with something like CIF coming to a CLF, that's the Community Investment Funds. The CLF then passes on to the SAG so that the SAG can then make loans. Those loans, or the interest from that loans, comes back to the CLF as interest income. Okay, so there's a link that goes from SAG lending to CLF interest income. And then from CLF interest income, that goes back to SAGs. The CLF interest income supports all the activities of the CLF, helps make SAGs stronger. So if you don't have that link, then things would get broken. Okay, the graph over here, you won't be able to read it in detail, so let me just tell you. The red bars are total income. I've done this across different years, so 2019 to 2023, of CLFs, from a survey of CLFs that was part of our survey. The blue bar right next to it is interest income. So you can see how interest income dominates all sources of income for the CLF. Okay, so that's that interest income that goes back to SAG loans and creates the cycle. SAG loans passed on an interest, CLF's income grows, comes back to SAGs, and you have a great cycle. What breaks that cycle? The answer is SAG absorptive capacity, weak networks. Okay? Suppose you start with CLF operations as supporting absorptive capacity. Okay, so suppose you don't have that, CLF operations are not working well, then that interest income goes nowhere, doesn't go back to SAGs, and that cycle is broken. Okay, so what are the operations that are particularly useful? I'm going to highlight the operations of the subcommittees. The Livelihood Subcommittee, the Social Action Committee, the SAG VO Monitoring Committee, and a whole host of other committees that are run by the CLF. What is their role? They prepare monthly plans, they provide training, they monitor progress. They are really the means by which all these things turn into action at the SAG level. So how does a subcommittee work? To go back even further and think of the details of that, their staff costs. Okay, so the subcommittee, each subcommittee involves office bearers. It involves a cluster level person, generally the manager of the cluster, and it also involves staff from the district level and the state level, the technical expertise that comes in. Okay, so without that, you're not going to have a functioning CLF. Of course, staff costs itself are combined with other costs. Okay. The members of the CLF subcommittees have to travel to the villages, have to travel to SAGs, they have to monitor VOs. All those include costs. And those costs, including the staff costs for the cluster level staff, come from interest income. So the CLF has to put aside some component of its interest income to support its operations and to make sure that it works well. Okay. The graph on the right-hand side is costs and how those are spent. So the red bar are total expenditure, and the blue bar next to that are salaries, and then travel, office costs, and meetings. Okay? So the first set of graphs is on MCLFs, and you can see from the top graph and the bottom graph, in the top graph, the interest income of model CLFs has been increasing over the course of 4 or 5 years, and you can see that the expenditure then is also increasing over those 4 or 5 years. Okay? If you compare that to the second panel, which is the non-MCLF cluster level federations, their income is stagnant. Their expenditure still remains, they still have to pay some costs, etc., as a result of which you get non-sustainable CLFs. Okay, so for the CLF to be sustainable, you have to have this interest income. What I have outlined is an institutional poverty trap. Okay, you start off with a CLF, which could be of initially low quality. That means there's a lack of SAG absorptive capacity because they don't have the ability to train SAGs and pass on that learning. We then end up with SAGs in which loans are sitting idle. So this is a well-known problem of idle funds at every level of the federation. And with the lack of SAG lending, you don't get interest income, and so CLF income dwindles. That goes back in a cycle, creating this institutional poverty trap. Okay? With low CLF quality, there is no benefit of the federation. Okay? You have CLFs then in paper, but that are not operational. And so unless you can ensure the quality of SAGs, all we have is a bunch of institutions that are not functioning well. Okay, how do you break this trap? Well, the institutional poverty trap is like any other trap. You break it through a big push. And going back to the previous slide, that big push, well, it's all the way at the bottom, so you probably can't see it. The big push is going to come in staff and it's going to come in funds. Those are the two basics on which you build these committees. Okay. The essence of the MCLF program, what does the MCLF program do and what does it contribute to that, is exactly these 2 points. The first is human capital. So if you look at MCLFs, they have more dedicated senior officers and technical experts coming to them through the organization. The second basic thing that is different is funds. They have unrestricted viability gap funding. This is a relatively small amount, 20 lakhs per CLF, but the key part of this is that it's unrestricted. It can be used to support staff expenditure, travel costs, whatever the CLF wants. Okay, I'm going to contrast that to CIF, the community investment funds that have got a lot more attention. CIF comes to the CLF, has to be passed on to the SAG for on-lending. I also contrast it to SAG bank linkage, which actually diverts funds away from CLF interest income. And in that sense, it does not support the operations of the CLF. In MCLFs, this graph shows the greater number of staff by year. Okay, so I'm just supporting the point that what matters is staffing and costs, and that is critical over here. Our study documents the sizable returns to MCLFs. Okay, in terms of household per capita consumption, in terms of household income, the results are double what you see in other CLFs. The same is true of structural change. And those results support the framework of the first talk. Targeted programs such as NRETP can deliver large universal benefits if community institutions are strong and function effectively. So I look at the evidence we provide on MCLFs as illustrating this point. For NRETP to have a large effect, CLFs have to work well. As additional support for this hypothesis, we can test some of the predictions of institutional poverty traps. And the prediction is that if your capacity is really weak, you're not going to be able to get out of that easily. You then need so many additional resources that you're going to be stuck in the trap. And so the ones that succeed are the ones that are closer to this breakthrough level. And that's exactly what we find. We looked at data by the CLF, so this is just the variation across CLFs that differ in the number of subcommittees, because I have emphasized that subcommittees is a link between CLFs and SAGs. And you will see in the graph on the left, this is model CLFs. The return to model CLFs is higher when these subcommittees are functioning. We don't see that same kind of impact in CLFs that are not model CLFs because they have not received this big push. You're stuck in a trap, you need a big push. If you get that big push, you can get out of it. I want to rule out MCLF effects as a consequence of higher CIF. Okay? We find no evidence to support this, and it shouldn't be surprising. Okay? The CIF amount that a CLF gets is per SAG. And so that is passed on per SAG and goes to the SAGs. So it does not support the core activities of the CLF, which is what I've been emphasizing as important. Okay, so what are the policy implications of this? I go back to finding a statement from the Radhakrishna Committee report at the start, from the Sampurna SGSY program. In evaluating it, they made this claim that institutions of the poor are nothing but poor institutions. You either need initially strong CLFs, which could vary perhaps because of socioeconomic context, differences in states and income levels, educational, that will mean differences. Or alternatively, you need this big push intervention of human capital and funds to capacitate the CLFs and make them functional. So the results, I'm using this as an example to support the framework of the first talk, that the universal benefits of NRETP can only come if we develop strong CLFs and a strong federation. To move on to the second program, the integrated farming clusters. This is a program that is in its infancy. So unlike a lot of the research, it's just taken a long time to come. I hope this comes early enough that we can actually do something about IFCs and talk about it. This is that second big circle. It's a big push to the development of local markets. And I want to take a minute just to highlight what I mean by this. Okay, so in some of the discussion that came in the morning, we talked about linking villages to markets. And that is how a lot of the discussion goes. We have urban markets, more remunerative markets, national markets, and we need to link villages to that market. Well, there's a second aspect. We can develop markets. They don't have to be links to others, but we can have this endogenous formation of markets. And how does that happen? That happens through increased specialization, by which I mean more backward and forward linkages. Okay, what drew me to the IFC program was this concept of backward and forward linkages that is central to it. That if you develop that, not only do you develop that, but you do it in a coordinated manner. So there is a big push again over there. It's not that you're saying, okay, you want to start a processing mill, go ahead, and some other villager will start, something else. But it's this coordination of backward and forward linkages that can help a local market develop, and the IFC does that. Okay, so these photographs are again drawn from Maharashtra, where this IFC study that we are undertaking is based. The top row is all the backward linkages, and the bottom row is all the forward linkages. And it comes out very clearly in the IFC district expenditure. This is just again from the Maharashtra IFC. The money goes in capacity building. That's the first row. So about 16% of total funds goes in capacity building. But 76% of the funds go in this community investment support. And that community investment support is for backward and forward linkages. So this is an example of all the things that are supported within the agricultural sector: plant nurseries, irrigation systems, shed net, input shop, processing unit, collection centers. So these are the backward and forward linkages that are intrinsic to the program. Okay. IFC, I'm getting a little bit into methodology just because it also has strong policy implications. So bear with me through this. IFC is limited in geography and in scale as it currently stands. The plans are to scale it up. But as it currently stands, it's implemented in 3 villages of each cluster with 100 beneficiary households in each village, a total of 300. So there are approximately 6 to 7 enterprises per village. Okay? Once I say that, you would be shocked again to find any impact of IFC. If there are only 100 households being benefited in a village, and in the early stages of which this program is in, we don't even find that 100, maybe 20 or 30 as it scales up. So you'd be shocked to find any impact. Where does that impact come? It comes again from NRLM's layered approach. IFC is not a standalone program. It is layered on top of NRETP. So these are only NRETP blocks in which IFC is being implemented. You can see very vaguely, I think, those yellow bars and the green bars. Those are examples of the villages. That's the IFC villages in one cluster. These are the IFC villages in another cluster. And again, looking at the whole block, you can say, well, this is a small program in scale. Okay. The standard evaluation question would be, does IFC improve household outcomes? And what I am telling you is that question is the wrong question to be asking. We should be asking, what is the combined effect of IFC and its base, NRETP, because that is exactly what the policy is. So we ask, what is the value of the layered approach? What is the value of putting IFC on top of strong markets? Okay, this is normally a very difficult question to answer because IFC was layered only on NRETP blocks. And NRETP blocks are generally uniform in socioeconomic conditions, uniform in the implementation of NRLM, so there's no variation. So where will that variation come from? That variation comes from something we recognized, that if you look at these, and these are 2 different blocks of Maharashtra, but we can replicate this for all the blocks. And if you look at the IFC clusters, the villages, you will notice that a large number of them are border villages and border clusters. Okay? By which I mean, again, looking at this particular map, they border other blocks that are not necessarily NRETP blocks. And in many cases, they are late blocks. So it means that if I look at a 10-kilometer radius, if I look at the local market that surrounds any village, there's actually a lot of heterogeneity in conditions in there. Some are very advanced and some are very backward. That obviously has policy implications because it affects the returns and it helps identification of their effects. Okay, so this is, again, blocks in Maharashtra, and I've done the same thing that I did in the last one. So we have colored in the PGs. The light blue is no PGs, dark blue is one PG, and then goes on from there. This graph is taking Ketanji and Kelapur. These are two NRET blocks and IFC blocks. And so if you look across the border, you will see that on either side, you're going to have other PGs and build for a very strong local market. Okay? Mul, on the other hand, borders on Savali, which is a late block. And so the villages that come, the IFC villages in Mul, actually are very weak because they lack that same local market. Okay, so our villages, the IFC villages, not our villages, are over here. And they share this border with Savali in which there is no activity in terms of PGs. This, again, is just summarizing what I've said. It shows the number of PGs by village location. So the red bar is the number of PGs when you border an NRETP district, when IFC villages are bordering an NRETP. The dark blue is IFC villages that are interior to a block, and the last bar is IFC villages that border an NRLM village. So again, that is just showing you the difference in activity. This translates into a huge difference in the impact of IFC. Okay, so for villages, IFC villages that border NRETP, consumption is 21% higher. It actually becomes even higher because of a point that I did not emphasize, but I should have. The policy guidelines for IFC say that these three villages should be contiguous to each other, and that the clusters, so here's one cluster and here's another cluster, the clusters should also be contiguous to each other, so that eventually you have developed this huge geographical pattern which will have a large effect and spillover. Okay? That is not the way it has been implemented, because I think perhaps the importance of this big bang approach has not been recognized. Okay, so the clusters themselves, the villages in a cluster are spread out. And so it means that in the set of IFC villages, you can sometimes have just one IFC village, sometimes two IFC villages, and sometimes three IFC villages. And so if we allow for that, the returns from IFC double again if you have three IFC villages in the cluster. Okay. The additional results, apart from the consumption and income effects, align with markets of local development. In agriculture, there's a huge increase in the use of purchased inputs. So we collected data on every single input and whether it was purchased in the market or whether it was homegrown, and we see that change. There's an increase in female labor force participation. There's an increase in own farm work and a shift to agriculture. And then there's a massive transformation in terms of non-agriculture and the shift to non-agriculture. So what are the policy implications of this particular study? The concentration of backward and forward linked enterprises within a local market helps develop markets. And I put a footnote there in terms of fidelity to implementation. IFC villages are not always within 10 kilometers of each other, and the returns are much greater when they are. There's a value of layering IFC on NRETP villages. If you started from scratch and tried to do this, like if you started in late blocks, and I'm only mentioning it because in some of the states it is being developed in late blocks, you will not get an impact. Okay? So layering again is critical. And then the last is a point that builds again on what we talked about earlier. Given that women are primarily working in villages, in their own village, the critical importance of local market development, which is what the IFC program does for female labor force participation. There are lots of qualifications to what I talked about for IFC in particular, because the program is in its infancy and obviously requires follow-up research. There's a high use of convergence funds, and so it's difficult to give any estimates of costs and benefits because you're stepping out of NRLM and then going into ministries, etc. And then there are important questions which we have not addressed as yet. I hope we will be able to do so. If you have a cluster and you focus on 3 villages in the cluster, what happens to all the other villages in the cluster? So conclusions on MCLF and IFC, they support the framework of the first talk. Structural change and significant income growth require large, big push investments on those 2 circles, on strengthening and expanding social networks, and on strengthening local markets directly. And as I said, are given examples of programs that are being implemented by the ministry that do exactly that. So this is not just academic wishful thinking that this should happen. This is translating into reality on how those changes are being made. Some reflections on MIS data. Evaluating staggered at scale, by which I mean universal programs, requires us to ask different questions, use different methods, and use different data. So the different questions I've given you examples of. Not much interest, at least on my part, of saying what is the pure impact of IFC, because we know what that impact is. So this is a rhetorical question also. The other part, outcomes of interest vary across stages. Okay, so asking about what has been the income change in a stage which is supposedly focusing on getting that community institutions developed, again, is not fair to the program, and we need an understanding of what are the right questions to ask at each stage. The magnitude of the change for any given outcome also varies with stage. So how can we evaluate staggered programs that operate at scale? This is an old empirical literature, not that old. Oh. We can evaluate, and we should evaluate at different nodes. So we identify the impact at each node by looking at implementation at each node. And that requires us to use MIS implementation data. I think without that data on implementation, you cannot evaluate these kinds of programs. Okay, so this is going back to the graph that I put up in the first presentation. You can see different nodes. And so I can look at the node, the point where you start NRETP. And I can evaluate the impact of NRETP, but only if I can control for the factors that led to the selection of NRETP blocks, and that's where the MIS data come in. So you think of all the different nodes, and you can layer on. So if you're starting a new program, start at that particular node, get the implementation data, and add on to it. And then we leave it to other people who can put together all that evidence and say, here is what you got out of it. We used NRLM MIS data intensively for identification at nodes. And the credibility of our results stems from our ability to use this data. So again, huge thanks to the ministry for this. We used it to control for, so I skipped all the methodological details, but we have used it to control for the selection of samples at every stage of our research. We've used it to control for treatment heterogeneity, the fact that the implementation in late blocks was significantly different from implementation in early blocks. We used it to measure initial conditions, which determine all the outcomes forward. And more importantly, we needed data not just on MIS in the survey villages, we needed it for the census of all villages, all blocks, and all districts. And because MORD provides that data, this research was possible. LOCUS provides huge potential for rich research, and I'm emphasizing the point that it provides a potential for research on policy effectiveness, not impact evaluations that is this 5-year, every now and then. But for policy effectiveness, it provides huge potential. I've listed a bunch of topics. I have to say these are my wish list of research topics, but I'm sure everybody will add on their own wish list. It needs an extra step. Okay, so the data first has to be research ready or research suitable. And those are things that I hope the community of researchers will work with MORD in doing that. Close by saying that research on at-scale, staggered, long-term programs also requires a long-term commitment to research. And MORD is unique, I think, amongst many ministries and governments in terms of providing that long-term commitment. This was not a project when you said, please go give us results, and that's the end of the conversation. But there has been this commitment, not just on MORD, but I should also say on the part of the Gates Foundation and the World Bank that are partners to this. So again, thank you.